But the vast majority of American academia seems to report some need to make moral equivalence, some need to even try and comprehend Hamas, some need to condemn Israel. And I want you to understand, irrespective of how you feel of the politics, Israel is not fighting a conventional conflict with Hamas about dismantling rocket attacks or arguing over territory or border or access to resources. This is a battle that the United States has prosecuted for 25 years since 9/11. It is the same battle that a multinational coalition waged against ISIS. ISIS, I think, was destroyed. It was not defeated. There's a big difference. Destroy means dismantle. Defeat means you can never be reconstituted. And so this war is of completely different proportions. And what staggered me is why the same academia, the same educated, wealthy communities that felt horrified at ISIS, would never contemplate of raising the flag of ISIS, are now providing surrogate legitimacy to Hamas in a way that's extraordinary. It's not only American academia, and I really want to know how I can be part of an academic response to counter that. One thing NYU did is when individuals were putting pictures of the kidnapped and the missing, and other people were taking them down, NYU and the Tisch family, I think, arranged for the images of the kidnapped and missing hostages to be projected on NYU library buildings. So there are responses to this. But it's also the international community. It's also Muslim majority leaders whom I greatly encourage to come and stand in the same places that I've stood, walk in the same autopsy places, see the movie that I saw of the 43 minutes of atrocities that Peretz hopes university presidents will see, I hope Muslim leaders will see. But the only difference I can see between the world's reaction to ISIS against the Yazidis, a genocide which also claimed the lives of non-Yazidi Kurds, also targeted Christians, if you remember, is that the target here is Jewish. And this to me means there is now open anti-Semitism, and anti-Semitism has many forms, and anti-Semitism unfortunately has been incubating in American universities for decades. And most of the anti-Semitism people think about in the United States, let's say, might be right-wing or neo-Nazi anti-Semitism is often discussed. I've spent about 15 years understanding Islamist anti-Semitism, and I'll just say a couple of words about that. Islamist anti-Semitism looks at a central tenet, a core belief, is lethal enmity with global Jewry, Judaism, Israel, anything that has any relationship with the Jew. There is a lethal enmity. That enmity is not mortal. It's not a conflict. It's not a war. It is a cosmic enmity. It has been religionized by a political totalitarian ideology with roots in Marxism. Islamism has taken that as a cover, almost that this is a religious duty, that there is some kind of honorable afterlife if you prosecute this lethal enmity. That is one of the central philosophies of Islamism. If anybody wants to read about Islamism, the best author I've discovered in English is Bassam Tibi, who's written for 40 years on this subject. Some of his work is translated into English, most of his work is in German. So you can read tomes written by Muslim scholars about Islamism. There is a reason why Egypt has outlawed the Muslim Brotherhood. There is a reason why Mohammed Morsi was ousted by 93 million Egyptians. Muslims do not tolerate Islamism to govern over themselves. This time last year, I was being honored in Saudi Arabia by Dr. Muhammad al-Isa, the Secretary General of the Muslim World League, because of everything that I've said condemning radical Islam. We talked an enormous amount about anti-Semitism and left-wing anti-Semitism and woke ideology, which I'll speak about. The Saudis have expunged Islamist ideology from their textbooks, their schools. Dr. Mohammed al-Isa, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, King Abdullah, even King Fahd were gradually diluting reactionary clerics with more pluralistic clerics, so that Dr. Mohammed al-Isa has hosted Jewish rabbis. They've had a minyan in Riyadh, and you saw this attack happening days after the Crown Prince himself confirmed to Fox News that there was every day a step closer to rapprochement with Israel. So as Muslims, we reject Islamism, even as there seems to be a Muslim support for incubating and empowering Hamas. That could be considered Qatar, that could be considered Iran, that could be considered Turkey, and that could be considered the outpouring of Muslim sympathy for Hamas in the face of the scenes in Gaza. Some of the most thoughtful relationships I have with Muslims who are really dear friends have been outraged at my documentation of what I'm seeing, including family members. But I'm not speaking of the crime against humanity that is occurring in Gaza. This is something that I get every day, and I'm probably going to have to answer for it in my family homes. There is no equivalence. There is no equivalence. If there is a genocide occurring in Gaza, that is the intention of Hamas that is willing to sacrifice its own population, its own fellow Muslim population in service of its political aims. Some of my close friends in Israel go and do a 12-hour duty at night for the IDF in Arabic, calling the families in North Gaza to move south. The humanitarian corridor that was opened by Israel and Egypt to allow some supplies. There can be no basis for Israel to continue to provide fuel and energy and electricity for an Islamist jihadist group that is already apparently with 4 months of fuel supply in Gaza at the moment. We know that Hamas also uses medical infrastructure to shield its headquarters of operations. And so Hamas has calculated, war-gamed, the international response to Israel, and the academic response is playing into that role. How did American academia or British academia become so enmeshed so that they see Hamas as liberators, or they see them as heroes, or they see them as victims? They didn't make that calculation for ISIS. There is no difference in the ideology. In fact, Hamas is more malignant and better financed than ISIS ever was. That's where left-wing anti-Semitism comes into the fore. And I refer to it as woke neo-orthodoxy. There's probably better ways to describe it. But in the United States, we're seeing for about 15 years the adoption of something called critical race theory. I was completely unaware of it until the pandemic, when all of the country stayed home and the children were on Zoom doing their classes and parents began to notice what was going on. And critical race theory really classifies everybody as either victim or oppressor. There's no other standard. And they use this classification on children in America. So little children come home and have to write an essay on why they regret being a white oppressor when they are 6 or 7 or 10 years old. It's an absolute distortion of history. It's absolutely dehumanizing of the American people. And the victim is everyone except those who are descendants of the greatest crime against humanity, the Jewish people. In this construct of critical race theory, the Jewish person has been inverted into the Nazi. Israel has been inverted into a colonial occupier state. While that might sound like something in a graduate class, it has become extremely ripe breeding ground for a marriage with Islamism, which also has lethal anti-Semitism. And so now you see terrible scenes in people that are in the line of fire in Gaza. This fits the victim narrative. There has been almost no mention of the atrocities that happened in Israel in the language of crime against humanity that I'm describing to you. Think of Rwanda and how that was reported for those of us old enough to remember Rwanda. Think of Bosnia. Both genocides were allowed to go on too long before the world intervened, but there was no dilemma about the language. Instead, what I'm seeing in the news media and in the popular culture is a total erasure of the October 7th events. And erasing the Jewish identity is also part of this critical race theory, woke neo-orthodoxy. And there's certainly one document that I can share that's very detailed with permission that will describe this structure. That woke culture of victimhood being prized above all else except for the Jewish person has penetrated so deeply in the United States. It's adopted by Hollywood, it's adopted by media, it's adopted by corporations. Where is Nike and Coca-Cola standing with the families of the victims that I've seen their bodies? Where they stood with groups like Black Lives Matter, they stood with things to do with George Floyd, they stood with, who knows, vaccination, get your COVID shots, but they cannot stand with this. And that tells you that this ideology is extremely deep. So we have to recognize left-wing anti-Semitism, ultra-progressive anti-Semitism is very empowered by woke ideology. And that is a perfect marriage with the Islamist anti-Semitism of the jihadist groups. We are now in a world where people consume the news they want. They consume the fake news they want. We are in an era of deep fakes. We're in an era of misinformation with the rise of digital internet and all this technology that allows us to get information immediately. We're also in the age of ignorance. there's a rise of ignorance. There's an amazing book that you might want to read about by Richard Proctor, who actually documented the history of big tobacco. And he is a professor of history at Stanford, but an honorary professor of pulmonary medicine. And he's written a book on agnotology, the culture and manufacture of ignorance. If you think about big tobacco, when it first came out, it was the most wonderful thing since sliced bread. And everybody was going to be healthy and happy, and even doctors were smoking tobacco. And then when people became sick, they funded research and said, look, we're doing research. And then when the mice developed cancers, they said, well, it has mouse carcinogens. There is a deliberate strategy to manufacture ignorance, and sometimes it's important. Sometimes it's a matter of national security that states do this. But we're in an era where ignorance travels greater distances than fact, and the only way to fight this is by repeating the truth and by inundating influences about the truth. What I think the United States and Europe doesn't realize is the atrocities that occurred in Kibbutz Be'eri and other places can easily occur anywhere else. I feel very concerned about the vulnerability of my Jewish colleagues. They have been attenuating their personal demonstrations of whatever their clothing and their religious head coverings already in New York, where we have the largest population of Jewish people outside of Israel. So this is a real dilemma for university leaders and for academia. And I think there's another factor at play, which is that university leaders are themselves cowed and intimidated by the very emboldened woke ideology. Because speaking up for the Jewish person, speaking up for the follower of Judaism is not seen as celebrating or embracing inclusion. I know we have leaders here of diversity and inclusion. That diversity, equity, and inclusion has never incorporated the Jewish voice, as far as I can see, in my role as a physician in a university. I'm not involved in these committees, but somehow it always excludes the Jewish voice. And this brings me maybe to one of my final ideas, and then I'd be happy to answer questions, which is that there has been the concept of intersectionality. I'm not deeply familiar with that. For instance, I'm a Muslim, I'm a woman, I was a migrant, I'm a naturalized American. Everybody has multiple identities. In this concept of intersectionality and pursuit for diversity, equity, and inclusion, added to critical race theory, victim and oppressor, there is a tremendous Holocaust envy, a grotesque thing for me to say. And so I think it is not accidental that the scenes in Gaza are being described as a crime against humanity. The scenes in Gaza are being described as a genocide that Israel has perpetrated. I've seen that on social media. I don't know if it's in the news. And that is to acquire the world's guilt and compassion over a scene that is devastating. There are innocent lives being lost. I've dedicated my life to preserving life. I don't want harm to come to innocent families. But this is not a genocide that's being prosecuted by Israel. There is rightful, legal, and lawful response to prevent further genocide. That is well encapsulated in the laws surrounding military conflict. To not respond would mean to invite further expanded genocide, so the Israeli state has no choice. And also, if the Israeli state does not succeed at defanging and really bringing to ashes Hamas, this ideology is ripe to spread in other regions. Though I've had tremendous joy looking at the progress in Saudi Arabia, and most of the population in Saudi Arabia now, 70% has an average age of under 30. The mean age is 28. They're very interested in advancing their society. They see this society as collaborators, partners, science, technology, agriculture, industry, all of these trades, very, very natural fit. There is always the possibility that there is still some fundamentalist reactionary sympathies, and the scenes in Gaza are deliberately framed and deliberately projected and deliberately shared with the intention of inciting that sentiment. Remember, the first Friday, Hamas declared a global day of jihad, and then I think a second Friday, Iran also declared a global day of jihad. On those days, I hadn't even arrived there. A person was stabbed almost fatally outside the Israeli embassy in Beijing. That is the intention. We've already seen 2 teachers, I think, killed in France by Islamist Chechnyan jihadists in Paris. We've seen the head of a president of a synagogue in Detroit, who in fact was leading a Muslim-Jewish society, stabbed to death outside of her home, and the US authorities were afraid to call this a hate crime. So radical, woke, neo-orthodoxy is silencing many decent voices. if I think about my initial journey to this, and I have also visited Krakow and I visited Auschwitz, it was when I was asked to read the book Hitler's Willing Executioners by Daniel Goldhagen by my own psychotherapist, so I could understand the complexity around what was then the war between Hezbollah and Israel in, I think, 2006. And there I learned about the role of the bystander. Without willing executioners and with silent bystanders, the crime against humanity of the Holocaust was unstoppable for years. And that's why I think all of us have a responsibility, first to bear witness to what has happened to all of you. And if we're scientists and physicians and we have the ability to see things that the lay public can't see, that should be seen, because I think bearing witness is the first responsibility of humanity. I think the second responsibility, perhaps even more pressing than igniting the relationships in university leaders, is the need to have legal scholars here to quickly classify this as a crime against humanity and as a genocide. That should be done independently of any political conflict or any military conflict that's going on. And as I understand it, there's only a certain amount of time that you can get evidence that will still be valid and nothing will be rebuilt over the places. I think that's very, very essential. And I think the third thing is to expose the damage and destruction that's being achieved at the service of woke neo-orthodoxy. That doesn't mean that I don't believe in inclusion and diversity. My whole life has been pluralistic. I think a place like the Technion is now under pressure because of this conflict, the emotions, the fake news, the social media, maybe the sentiments, the pain. But a place like this can also rise out of that and become even more strongly knitted together. So I think those are the thoughts that were in my brain to speak to you. But I'm happy to talk some more. And thank you very much for allowing me to bear witness to what's happened here.